So, welcome to the State of Accessibility podcast from Vispero. I'm David Sloan, Chief Accessibility Officer for Vispero, and each month I'm joined by a guest or two to discuss a topic of interest and relevance to the practice and profession of digital accessibility. And for episode 21, which is August 2026, we are looking forward to the imminent publication of version 4.1, the latest version of EN301549, the European standard for accessibility requirements for ICT products and services. Now, EN301549's new version is currently slated to be published on August 28th after a lot of work to update it over the last couple of years. And given its connection to the European Accessibility Act and its wide applicability across websites, software applications, hardware, documents, we thought it would be a good idea to spend this week's podcast exploring EN31549, especially for people who might not be so familiar with its content, may have heard of it, but not sure exactly what it covers, and its value in building and maintaining accessible products. And back with me to discuss EN31549 is Vispero's UX scripting and kiosk practice manager, Dave Swallow. Welcome to the podcast, Dave, and welcome to
Thanks,
the new
sir.
job title.
Yes, thank you. Yep, pleasure to be back. It's thankfully a bit cooler here than last time we spoke.
Yeah, I think we've got right now 1 day of cool rain, but then it's back to more summer weather, I think,
Yeah,
next week.
yeah. The
So yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say the publication date for this snuck up on me a bit, really. I got it in my head it was later in this year, and I think it's been pushed back a bit, hasn't it, as well?
It has, yeah. And when we were planning this podcast, I had to double check to make sure it wasn't being pushed back. Obviously, we want to talk about it just before it's launched, but if the launch date goes back,
Mm.
then we're kind of hanging around and waiting. It has been a long time coming. I know we're going to talk a bit more about EAA, and for those who've been following EAA, that came into force, at least the major deadline in June of last year. So it's more than a year after that this standard is going to be launched. So hopefully,
I did,
there won't be more of a delay.
yeah, I did hear that it has to be published in the official journal of the European Union, and that's not scheduled until November, and that's when it becomes a harmonized standard. So it's
Right.
pub yeah, there's EN's published now, but the actual harmonization happens in that when that's published, apparently.
Yeah. I guess
So
there's a legal process there, and
mm.
we don't need to go into too much detail, but yeah, there's definitely some sort of process administration hoops uh, that have to be jumped through. But hopefully, in terms of the requirements, the stuff for
Yeah, the
people building
content's
and
finalized.
managing products, we're at a point where things are stable and it's something that can be useful to guide product and service development. So with all that, maybe you could start just by, especially, for people who might not be so familiar with EN31549, talk us through what it covers in terms of the types of digital product and the requirements they provide, and any additional requirements that might be unexpected for an accessibility standard.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, a bit of an explainer. Yeah, so EN31549 is the European Standard for Accessibility of Information and Communication Technology, or ICT. And a lot of people are probably more familiar with it in relation to websites and mobile apps, where there's a significant overlap with WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. But EN31549 is actually, much broader than WCAG. It covers a wide range of digital products and services, including websites, mobile and desktop applications, but also electronic documents, hardware, telecommunications, video and multimedia, and then self-service terminals like kiosks. And that broader scope is important because different types of technology obviously introduce different accessibility requirements. So many of the requirements are going to be familiar because as I say, they're based on WCAG. But if we are talking about, say, a self-service kiosk, there's additional considerations that WCAG doesn't really address. It's that beyond WCAG kind of area, speech output and tactile controls, that sort of thing.
Hmm.
Um, we've got telecommunications that has its own set of requirements. Even software itself, separate from the web, that has its own set of requirements. So it gives us a much broader framework for thinking about the accessibility of ICT as a whole. And another important part of the standard is that it's not only concerned with the product interface itself, it also has another number of requirements related to the documentation and the support that accompany that product. So if a product has accessibility features, the documentation needs to explain what those features are and how to use them, and then the documentation itself has to be accessible and provided in an accessible format. And then there's also requirements related to support services and the needs of disabled users when they're seeking assistance. So yeah, it's not just looking at whether a web page or a screen meets WCAG. It's much more holistic,
Hmm.
looking at whether people with disabilities can access and use ICT.
Yeah, and I know that with WCAG, which is probably the most familiar standard or set of accessibility requirements, it historically has applied to the web. I know that WCAG 3 is trying to change that so that it's not web specific. And then people who are building other types of digital product, like a kiosk or even a native mobile app, have to kind of translate how web
Mm.
accessibility guidelines apply to non-web technologies. And the
Yeah.
WCAG to ICT document, which W3C produced as a helpful translator of WCAG into other formats, it's a separate thing. Whereas with EN31549, you have a more broadly encompassing digital accessibility standard where there's a section for web applications and content, and then the next section is for non-web software. So it's all in one document rather than you start with web and then try and figure out how something that's very web centric
Mm.
applies to something non-web centric. So I think that's
And it's normative guidance as well, isn't it? Rather
right,
than just
exactly.
additional
Yes,
supplementary
yes,
stuff.
yeah, yeah. And I know that the work on WCAG to ICT heavily informed what's appearing in EN31549, the latest version. So there's some good cross cross collaboration there to
Mm.
make sure that one informs the other. So that's definitely been encouraging to see.
Mm.
And I guess, I mean, we you talked about WCAG. Talk a bit more about the how what's the relationship of WCAG to EN 31549 in its in the format that we can expect to see in the next
Yeah,
version.
so um, for web content, the relationship is fairly. Sorry, I'm just dodging the sun here, so I'm just gonna have to move slightly over. For web content, the relationship's fairly straightforward. And EN 301549, the new version, incorporates WCAG 2.2, level A and double A. So organizations that are already targeting WCAG 2.2, they aren't facing a completely different set of web requirements. Um, but it's worth stressing that again that WCAG and EN31 are not interchangeable. WCAG is primarily web content, and EN31549 covers that much broader ecosystem. So so
And I
yeah,
get
it's the beyond which is key, I
yeah,
think here.
yeah, yeah. And I know that that parts of EN31549 adopt the applicable parts of WCAG, so especially for non-web software and documents, there's some incorporation of those requirements there. I mean, I guess it does mean that we have a sort of imbalance across different standards, especially thinking about in the US, the requirements of ADA Title II, which reference WCAG 2.1, and
Yeah.
EN31549 is going to have WCAG 2.2 as sort of as part of its requirements. So it kind of, I suppose it just makes more of an obligation to start looking at WCAG 2.2 as a core standard, especially if you're operating in or selling to or providing services and products in Europe.
Yeah, I feel so. That feels like the what is it, the superset really,
Hmm.
to be targeting, and you can scale it down for the different regions like Section 508,
Yeah.
but it makes sense to go for 2.2.
And I know that when we've looked at the previous version of EN31549, it's been adopted by other countries as well, like Australia and Canada, and Kenya. So I assume that we'll see something similar with the updated version, that it will also start to be adopted as a voluntary standard in other parts of the world. So,
Yeah.
whereas we talk about it as EN, where with E for Europe, but it's becoming more of a global standard, I guess, than its name might apply.
Yeah, it seems to be. Like you say, Australia and Canada, um, Kenya, India, and Japan have also got standards based on it, at least. It's not, wholesale adoption, but yeah. Canada's quite interesting because that's its new federal accessibility regulations reference the Canadian adoption of the EN31549 for areas like websites and mobile apps and documents. So yeah, it's becoming the um, well, WCAG, I think WCAG's still the international benchmark for web accessibility, but if you're going to be covering these additional products and services and things, EN gives you that much broader model
Hmm.
to follow.
And I suppose a lot of people who work with the voluntary product accessibility template, the VPAT, will be familiar with EN 31549, as its previous version was one of the formats of VPAT. And I assume that pretty soon after publication of version 4 of EN 31549, we'll see an update to the VPAT templates to the um, adopt the new version of EN 31549 into those
Yeah.
templates.
I haven't seen
So
a timetable for that, but I understand that they've always been quite responsive to that. So
yeah, I talked to somebody from ITI at the CSUN conference earlier in the year, and they said, they'd been working hard, and we're kind of, I mean, I don't want to paraphrase too much, but they're pretty much ready to go. So I think
right.
we can expect to see the version 2.6 of VPAT coming out pretty
Mm,
soon.
mhm. Yeah.
So yeah, that's something to prepare for. So I suppose that brings us to another question around the connection between um, uh, the EN31549 and the European Accessibility Act. The big motivator for this update was EAA, and they're often used in similar conversations. So maybe again, to sort of summarize for people who are maybe unfamiliar with the differences, what's the difference between EN31549 and EAA, and what's the relationship between the two?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I think the simplest distinction is that the EAA is the law, it's legislation, and EN 31549 is a technical accessibility standard. So the EAA tells organizations what accessibility outcomes they need to achieve for their products and services. Um, and EN 31549 provides much of the technical detail for how those requirements can be met and evaluated. And the connection between them is like I mentioned earlier, the concept of the harmonized standard. So the new version 4, EN 31549, has been developed specifically to support the EAA. And once it's formally harmonized, meeting the requirements of that can provide a presumption of conformity with the corresponding requirements of the EAA. So yeah, they're very closely related, but not interchangeable. The EAA is the legal obligation, and EN 301549 is a technical route for demonstrating that you've met those accessibility requirements.
Right. And that kind of indicates that EN31549 will still be a voluntary standard, but by showing that a product or service conforms to the standard, it shows that you can comply with the EAA's
Yes.
requirements. So it's a very good way to meet your legal obligations and guide you build an accessible digital product. And there are other standards supporting EAA. I mean, EAA is a pretty broad-reaching piece of legislation when it comes to digital product and service accessibility. And there are other standards underway that will become additional harmonized standards, right?
Yeah, this surprised me actually. I was aware there was more, but I didn't realize quite so much was going on really. Yeah. So EN31549 is part of a much broader standardization program. And there's different strands to that. One is EN17161, which is the European Design for All standard, and that's much more about organizational processes and how organizations can integrate accessibility and design for all into the way they design and develop and provide products and services. That might be worth exploring in
You
another
read my
episode.
mind. I was thinking we need to talk about this because I know, Wilco Fears from DQ has been
Yeah.
talking about the value of a process standard and whether, as we move towards version 3 of WCAG, should that include aspects of process
Mm.
operation or should it be kept separately? So the fact that EN 17161 is being updated, given its importance to helping organizations meet EAA,
Mm.
I think that's worth more conversation. So yeah, let's bookmark that and
Yeah.
come back to that in a
It
future
is a
podcast.
paid standard though, isn't it? I think that one.
Yeah, which
That's
is
not.
probably may help to explain its you know relative lack of awareness and
Mm.
maybe lack of adoption. It's yeah,
Yeah.
that's a whole debate for another thing.
Yeah.
Is standards cost money to develop, and
Yeah,
how
that's
is
it. Yeah.
how do you recoup that the cost of creating it? But
Yeah.
thankfully, EN 301549 is freely available. It's already freely available, even if it's not formally published. And I think
Mm.
that's ease of access to something that we want people to follow is a strong
Yeah.
indicator of how likely people will do it and follow it.
Yeah. And also the development process of it has been very open as well. With
Yeah,
all the Etsy forums, and you can contribute and help shape it there.
yeah. No, there's been a lot of work, just tracking the issues and noting where EAA or EAA's requirements need to be addressed in EN 301549. And
Mm.
you know, I I'm just in awe of people who really commit to standards work in terms of the level of detail, the late nights wrangling over the finest
Mm.
detail. And yeah, standards work is hard. And what
Hmm.
you end up is to some extent, I guess, a compromise. People have
Mm.
different perspective, different needs, different priorities. So to get somewhere is the result of a lot of hard work. And
Absolutely.
I guess we should, you know, share our appreciation to Etsy and all of the other bodies and individuals who put this together. In fact,
Mm.
anyone working in standards, it's hard work, and then
Mm.
it's published, and people just end up criticizing the bits that are missing or aren't worded. But
Yeah.
let's say thank you for the good work and the guidance that is there.
Absolutely.
One thing I wanted to, speaking of really valuable things that are in the updated version of EN31549, as often seems to be the case, is the stuff in the appendices, the stuff that people
Mm.
might miss. It's similar to WCAG, where there's so many helpful, supporting, informative resources that people should really start with reading before you dive into a specific success criterion or a specific technical requirement. Step back and read about how to use a document, how it came about, how it connects to other things. And I think there's some really helpful annexes in EN301549 that I confess that I sort of didn't pay attention to them until I sort of realized that they're there and they're incredibly useful. So
Yeah,
let's talk a bit
the
about the different appendices and what they what they provide. And
that that was the sort of first thing I was keen to see really is they've got an annex mapping EN31549 to the EAA requirements
mm,
because there was those clauses of the EAA which were always very ambiguous. I'm thinking things like is it visual clarity and audio clarity. Um, there's a few others around like measuring brightness of kiosks and with kind of these bold statements, but with little kind of explanation around them. And you can do your best kind of trying to fit existing standards to that, and oh, it might mean that, or that's kind of around that area. But yeah, we didn't have that official kind of direction there.
mm,
So yeah, it was very eagerly awaited, I think, that appendix. And sometimes it feels they haven't added anything new. They've just kind of, well, this, and this kind of contributes to that, So they point you to quite a handful of existing requirements. But there are some new mappings in there which are really helpful and just gives you that confidence as practitioners that that you're not making this up really. You are
yeah,
following the law.
yeah. And I guess another helpful annex is the connection of the technical requirements to the functional performance criteria, the kind of
Mm.
underpinning parts of accessibility is what needs to happen for people with this set of accessibility needs to be able to use the product. And Annex B in EN31549 is a really helpful table that shows how all of the different technical requirements for a specific ICT, whether it's a website or a document or a closed functionality system, need to be met to ensure that it's usable by people with a particular accessibility profile or set of needs. So that's another one where anyone sort of debating, oh, why do we need to do this? It next, well, it's beneficial for this user group. Without this requirement being met, this user group will find it difficult or impossible to use this product. So again, it's a way to connect technical requirements that might seem abstract with real world usage, which ultimately is what EAA and any other law that kind of helps reduce instances of disability discrimination. So
Hmm.
that's another useful appendix there.
And the functional performance, was it statements, criteria? This one I can't remember. That's got more of a role in EAA, hasn't it? It's more, it was more voluntary before, or more like a fallback kind of
Hmm.
set of requirements. If the others don't, if the other requirements don't meet, then can you show uh, conformance that way? But with EAA, I think it's a more formal requirement
Right.
to
Yeah.
demonstrate conformance with those statements. So that's
And that,
another
I
positive
guess that
note.
kind of speaks to Annex C, which is the normative uh, annex in amongst the whole set of informative um, uh, appendices
Mm.
that kind of give you additional context on how to use the standard. So Annex C is the determination of conformance. So it
Mm.
explains basically it's a whole series of test procedures for every requirement, including all the functional performance criteria, uh, to say this is how you test whether this requirement has been met, and gives you a pass or fail condition. So that's when it comes to testing, Annex C is going to be really, really valuable,
Mm.
including figuring out to what extent can this test be automated.
Mm.
Clearly, some of them are pretty broad, and are going to require human inspection. But to have that set of sort of test processes and pass-fail conditions is also going to be really valuable.
Yeah. 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 There's plenty in there.
One other thing, another appendix, and I'm definitely keen to get your perspective in this, given I know your interest in this area, is that the informative one, that's further resources for cognitive accessibility. It seems like that's kind of saying EN31549's kind of stuck with the current set of testable requirements for cognitive accessibility that could be argued as still falling short of what people with diverse cognitive accessibility needs actually need to be
Yeah.
met for effective use.
Yeah. I mean, it's good that it's in there. It's a bit brief. It's basically pointing to COGA, a cognitive accessibility task force.
Yeah,
Um,
I see
resources.
that the sort of research in this area is ongoing. It definitely feels like it's acknowledging that we still don't have the level of
Yeah.
technical requirements that we know are needed to
Yeah. Yeah.
address diverse user needs. So
I mean, that's a start that it's acknowledged at least, Um, but yeah, could always go further there, I think.
I think one other nice bridge from Annex D, which talks about cognitive accessibility needs, including plain language, easy to read, easy to understand language, that kind of connects into Annex E, where it's a very helpful plain language introduction to guidance on using of the standard and additional resources. So um, I think Annex E could be almost brought forward and that you read this first, because it
Yeah, yeah.
explains
Read
how
me.
to use
Yeah.
all the different parts of it of the standard.
Yeah, yeah. And reference the cognitive accessibility in there as well.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
so yeah, I know it's going to influence our work going forward, but excuse me. Um, how would what advice would give to organizations who are either already aware that an updated version of EN301549 is imminent, or weren't aware and are thinking, oh my gosh, we need to be thinking about this. How should organizations treat EN31549 when it comes out?
Yeah. I think it depends on why they're using it. So if you're an organization that needs to meet the European Accessibility Act, then the new EN 31549 is going to be obviously really important. Um, and once it's been harmonized, meeting that will provide that presumption of conformity
Mhm.
with the AA. Um, if you're primarily concerned with websites, then I think the transition is quite straightforward because, as I say, the new version adopts WCAG 2.2. Um, so organizations already targeting 2.2 AA are in a strong position. Um, but yeah, I think EN 31549 is particularly valuable beyond the web. So if it's software, kiosk, hardware, whatever it is, um, it's again that beyond WCAG where it's most valuable. But even if you're not subject to the EAA. This is now one of the most comprehensive and up to date accessibility standards that we've got. This is, it's cutting edge stuff. So I don't know. I see it not just as a strict compliance standard, but as a really useful best practice baseline, really, for making digital products and services accessible. So use it even if you don't have to.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice, especially when we think about in the US, Section 508, the ICT accessibility standards are, they're pretty old. They're showing their age. They incorporate WCAG 2.0. And here's a all-encompassing standard that covers all different digital technologies with
Yeah.
more requirements, kind of building on the Section 508 requirements. I know the previous version of EN301549 was pretty harmonized with the Section 508 requirements, and now we have an updated version. So it definitely, for organizations that that do want to provide usable products, this is something to look at. And again, encouraging everyone to read all of the appendices, the different annexes that are listed in EN31549, including connecting the technical requirements with the functional performance criteria. Again, you can't say it often enough. Technical requirements are there to help ensure that user needs are met, and ensuring that users can use your product for its intended purpose is the ultimate goal, from a legal compliance perspective, as well as making sure that people can be successful, that they can use a product. When people buy the product, can use it for its intended purpose, recommend it to others, use services, access content, participate in society. So that making that connection is really valuable, I think.
You don't need a European legal obligation to find the standard useful.
Right, right. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, and going back to what we said before, this may be a European standard right now, but it's likely to be a standard adopted in other parts of the world based on past history, with adoption of EN31549. And standards harmonization is something that we all want to see to make life easier, especially for organizations operating in multiple countries, knowing that there's a baseline of accessibility requirements that everyone needs, and then sure, there may be regional or local variations on top of that baseline, but we should expect to see EN31549 become a baseline for a large part of the world. So it makes sense to pay close attention to it and
Do you think
use
it
it
will
as
influence Section 508?
I don't know enough to be able to make confident predictions. I mean, it certainly seems the case that there isn't a lot of activity right now in the US in terms of updating existing standards. That may change. But given the decision to extend the deadline for the Title II rule for web content and mobile accessibility, it's kind of that decision is giving more time to meet an existing standard, which may suggest that directions to produce new standards might be a while coming. But I think if and when the US is in a position to update Section 508, then looking at what is covered in EN 301549 will be a very good predictor of what an updated Section 508 would look like. So again, being future looking, paying attention to the requirements in EN 31549 seems like a good idea.
It's a positive note.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a big standard. There's lots in it, but I do think that given it addresses all sorts of different technologies and has tried to connect technical requirements with their needs, I think it's a really valuable addition to the accessibility standards collection, and I definitely think that it's something that organizations should be paying attention to. It's a great asset. So hopefully,
Mm.
there'll be no last minute wrinkles
Mm.
in the progress to publication and adoption as a harmonized standard. And look forward to seeing it making impact.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Dave, thanks again for your perspectives on EN31549. I do think it's a step forward in the standards world and shows how accessibility needs for these diverse products that we increasingly work with can all be addressed in a single standard. And let's hope it does drive that positive change in
Mm.
accessibility in Europe and beyond. So
Absolutely.
now you know the state of accessibility. I'm David Sloan, thanking Dave Swallow and reminding you that the state of accessibility is always changing. So please help us affect change.